Sixth photo is a scene I encountered while taking one of my hikes, and it's a fallen tree. I like how the curvature of the tree leads the viewer, kind of like a snake, towards the center, then all the way to the far right. It's a very simple photo, but there's a lot of complexity in the simplicity. For example, the texture of the tree that has fallen is going to make or break the painting. Plus, the grass, going from very detailed to less detailed towards the back. And lastly, the hills in the distance, which will be more of a blur in the painting, but visible, and will help establish that sense of distance from detailed to less detailed. I start with a minor grid just to have things in place. Then I start building the underpainting. I'm laying out big shapes of color, lines, and some distinguishable features that will act as a roadmap, so when the grid disappears, I do not get lost in the painting of where everything falls. It's a simple start, but very useful. Even though the log is going to be the start of the painting, I start off with the background first, such as the trees, some of the leaf and foliage in the corner, and all the little branches and twigs that stick out. Even though I'm using a reference photo, I'm not copying it 100%. I'm making some changes, in some ways simplifying it, but also adding contrast by darkening around the branches and around the plants in the left corner so they pop out more. Speaking of branches, I knew ahead of time this was going to be one of the most complex sections because of all the intertwining twigs. The thing that helped me get through this is layering and knowing what layer is going to be on the very top and what's going to be hidden behind, such as the grass and then the branches on top. Speaking of layering, this was definitely a big challenge of picking what to work wisely. That's why you'll see me in the beginning of the painting focusing mostly on the background. Even though there's a lot of negative space in the background, to make it less boring, I tried to detail as much of the objects I saw, things such as little twigs, rocks, and the uneven earth. I also tried to include some of the trees, but I gave them a very soft touch so they receded into the background. Another challenging area to paint ended up being the negative space between the branches. Again, I focused on the background, painting the grass first, and then working my way with the branches on top. But I had to go back in between those branches here and there to detail some of the grass blades and plants that were visible. Again, the bottom left corner was the most difficult area to paint. I started working on the log at one point to start to get a feel of the texture. I didn't want to totally forget about it. Plus I was getting bored at working the background. This log is actually cut in two. I do not know how it happened, but it serves a purpose to establish some sense of depth. Because it's less detailed than the one in the front, it helps create a 3D illusion on a 2D surface. That's why I didn't over detail the back log, but I went all out on the one in the front. In order to get the texture, it required lots of layers of lines and color, and in order to make it more believable, I tried to stay true to the photo I was using. So I started building up lines and shapes and colors, and started fooling around also with some of the texture. I found wet on wet to be very useful in certain areas, because you could push the paint around to get certain effects, such as the bumps and the crevices of this dilapidated piece of wood. Plus there were so many different colors, certain oranges and blues. I tried making some of them stand out. In a way, if I saw the color, I added it. Even though the log is the start of the painting, I did spend a lot of time on the negative space and background. As you can see, the twigs and all the dirt that is around. Throughout this video, you'll see I'm constantly building the background, trying to capture as much things as possible. Even though the trees and hills in the distance are not that visible, I wanted to include them, but with a softer touch. But because of the distance, I'm not gonna focus too much on sharpness. And as you can see, it's more on a grayish bluish muted tone to give a sense of distance and depth. Compared to the log, this area of the painting is definitely on the softer side, and it acts as a nice contrast to the super detailed foreground. Again with the log, I'm trying to build up all the little crevices, and at the same time, I wanted to have a nice sense of contrast. It is a thing that attracted me to take the photo in the first place. I did my best to try to capture the log as accurately as possible. I'll be honest, I thought I bit off more than I could chew at one point, but I kept still pushing on. Lots of lines next to each other and a constant buildup of texture. Many breaks for sure. Something that was helpful into detailing the log was establishing guidelines such as the cracks and distinguishable features. This helped me not to get lost when doing all the detail. In a way, it was like a roadmap, helping me figure out where things go. Besides the texture, I also wanted to give it a sense of volume. So I paid attention to the transition of colors from the sides and darkened certain areas to push it into the back, especially in the bottom left where the plants and leaves are growing. And I sharpened certain edges, especially on the top of the log, so it stood out from the grass and dirt. In some ways, I knew what I was getting into, and it was quite challenging. And it was truly quite an experience I will carry on to future paintings. At one point, I needed to tackle the grass, and this is the area where I started getting more involved than the actual log. I had to build the grass from the back and work my way to the front to get a nice illusion of lines overlapping other lines. I just didn't want to paint the area green. I wanted to give the viewer a sense that there's actually lots of blades of grass. Yes, I know this is a tedious method, but I wanted the grass, in a ways, to act as a counterweight to the detail of the log. If you want to see a nice long demonstration on how I built this area, check out my video on how to paint grass. To sum up the technique of doing the grass, it involved an underpainting, lines, dry brushing, and constant layer building of more lines, especially towards the front. My method of creating grass, I wouldn't say it's the most conventional, especially since it involves lots of line work, but it's a technique I've been building for several years now. I never wanted to consider myself an actual realist. An illusionist, yes, but I also wanted to integrate some sense of impressionism in my work. The way I paint it, it's almost as if I'm trying to get a feel of how the grass is by looking at the photo and trying to replicate more of the impression of how it looks instead of actually paint the grass itself. The trickiest part of the grass was definitely where it meets the dirt or ground, because you have to make it look believable as if the grass is really coming out of the ground. It is a skill that I personally think I need to develop a little more myself. But one thing that helped was softening the bottom portion of the grass that touched the ground and sharpening the top, and also cooler tones on the bottom, because it makes sense. Grass in the shadow is definitely a cooler color tone. I wanted these twigs and branches to stand out from the background, so I started using very bright colors. It's not pure white, it's actually titanium white with a touch of yellow or orange. And then I also darkened some areas as well. And to further establish a sense of three-dimensionality, I made sure some of the branches and twigs were not as detailed, so they receded a little bit. And the ones that are very close up, I even detailed some of the bark that was still attached to them. Towards the end of the painting, I went back into these twigs and branches again and made others stand out. all based on where they were versus the other twigs. The further to the back, the more softer they would be and more muted as well. And the closer to the front, the more detailed and sharper. Even the paint was a lot thicker on the ones that were more closer. The goal in the end was to establish depth. Again, I'm working on the center of the painting, which is really just a patch of earth, but there's little plants in there and twigs. I didn't want the center to be completely boring, so I paid attention to the photo and I tried to capture as many of those little details that I saw. The left corner might have been probably the hardest part of the painting to do, only because of all the different leaves. I simplified this section the most versus the photo. At one point I was trying to accurately paint each leaf. Then I started to realize at some point that was just a bunch of random green patches everywhere. So the next step I did is try to push some of the leaves back by using darker tones and softer edges for them to recede. And then I used some brighter tones of yellow and white to make certain ones pop out even more. Like the twigs and branches behind, the goal was to create an illusion of depth, and detail and sharp lines in the front helped. And I softened the edges of the leaves that receded a little bit. Simplifying the leaves in the back helped push the ones in the front. It's not as simple looking in the photo, but it was necessary in the end not to overcomplicate that area and take away too much attention from the log itself. When painting grass that is closer to the foreground, you have to keep in mind sometimes patches of the earth is visible, so that's why I spent some time building up the earth. Also, before you actually paint the actual grass that's standing up, pay attention to some of the grass that has fallen or is pushed to the side. I looked at things such as cracks, twigs, little rocks, and also other plants besides the grass. A lot of the grass is definitely random, but I picked and chose certain ones that stood out in the photo, tried to capture them in the painting. Again, like the grass in the background, this was a constant buildup of layer after layer until I felt it was looking right, even more so than the background. I did use a dry brush in this area to soften some of them, but for the most part, most of the grass blades were sharper, and the ones up close I tried to detail a little more by giving them edges and different colors. Besides the grass, there was also certain things such as wheat or dandelions, and I tried to depict them as well. The more variation, the more lifelike I believed it would look. Because wild grass isn't as clean as regular grass in a person's lawn. There's lots of imperfections. They are all different sizes as well as shapes too. Plus, among the healthy grass, there's also some dead grass that will be on the ground, and others that are sticking a little bit to the left or right, and different heights. As for building the dirt on the ground, the texture is not completely flat and smooth, and there's lots of little bumps. One thing I try to do is capture the graininess of the dirt itself, and also the twigs and branches that were also on the ground. Instead of copying the photo 100%, I tried to capture a few grass blades that were very distinguishable that caught my attention. But mostly it was building a repetition of lines that gave the impression of the grass up close. Yes, it's very tedious, but to me it's worth it, because I like to go the extra mile when depicting detail in my paintings. One of the last things I did in the painting is go back into the log again. I felt the grass was overpowering the log, so I decided to add more detail. A minor debate of mine was whether to include that stick that was propped against the log. That for sure was placed by someone, and it didn't seem natural. But I included it because, in a way, it's how I remembered the scenery. Finishing a painting can be quite boring actually, not as exciting as the start. I went back into areas that I felt needed a little more work, like the center where all the dirt is. I added a few more grass blades that were alive because there were a few sticking out and I wanted some variation besides just twigs and dead grass. I simplified some and I added some highlights to certain blades as well. And when I looked a little more closer to the photo, I saw how some of the grass blades were bent too. And though it's not featured in this video, I darkened certain areas between the grass blades because I added too much grass and started hiding some of the dirt that was behind. At one point, I thought the painting was finished, and it wasn't. I had it in my living room and stared at it for a while, and I even posted it on Instagram saying it was finished. And as of today, it's still there, unfinished. But it kept bothering me, especially the bottom right corner, so I actually went back into it. What did I do? Really? I just increased the contrast and tried to make the grass look like it's actually sticking out from the ground instead of floating above it. Like mentioned earlier, that's a technique or skill that I need to work on myself to get better as an artist and illusionist. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. Sorry for such a long delay between videos. What can I say? I have been busy. Hopefully this video gave you some insight on how to paint a complex painting on a small canvas. Also check out my Instagram, Not Your Typical Painter of course, for more of my work. Once again, my name is Charles. I go by Bob. I'm not your typical painter. Stay tuned for my next piece. It's definitely going to be bigger and I have a long way to go. Thanks for watching. Bye.